A French documentary filmmaker's lens captured Senegal during one of its most turbulent decades, revealing truths about post-independence Africa that many would prefer to forget. Today, we're diving deep into Joel Arpaillange's groundbreaking work on Senegal in the 1980s, and why his observations remain shockingly relevant to modern Africa. Welcome back to the channel. I am your host, and today we're re-exploring one of the most important yet overlooked documentaries about African political transition. Joel Arpaillange, a French filmmaker and journalist, spent significant time in Senegal during the 1980s, documenting the country's struggles with economic crisis, political transition, and the complex legacy of French colonial influence. This isn't just another story about Africa's past. It is a masterclass in understanding how external documentation of African politics can both illuminate and distort our understanding of the continent. Like this video help more Africans see this story. Let us start with the context. By 1980, Senegal had been independent for exactly 20 years. Léopold Sédar Senghor, the poet-president and architect of Negritude philosophy, had ruled since independence in 1960. But the country was facing a perfect storm of challenges. The global economic crisis hit Africa particularly hard in the 1980s. Senegal, heavily dependent on groundnut exports and French economic support, saw its economy contract by an average of 0.8% annually throughout the decade. Unemployment soared, particularly among young people in urban areas like Dakar and St. Louis. But here is what makes Arpaillange's work fascinating. He arrived just as Senghor was preparing to do something almost unprecedented in African politics. In December 1980, Senghor voluntarily stepped down from power, transferring authority to his chosen successor, Abdou Diouf. This peaceful transition was remarkable. While countries like Uganda, Chad, and Central African Republic were experiencing violent coups and civil wars, Senegal was demonstrating that democratic governance was possible in post-colonial Africa. Arpaillange captured this historic moment, but his lens revealed the complexities beneath the surface. The filmmaker documented how French influence remained pervasive throughout Senegalese society. The CFA franc tied Senegal's monetary policy to French interests. French businesses dominated key sectors of the economy. Even the timing of political transitions seemed coordinated with French political cycles. Arpaillange's cameras captured what scholars would later call neo-colonialism in action. Now, let us examine the current situation that makes Arpaillange's work so relevant today. The 1980s crisis Arpaillange documented wasn't just an economic downturn, it was the beginning of structural adjustment programs that would reshape African economies for decades. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund imposed harsh conditions on Senegal in exchange for emergency loans. Public sector employment was slashed. Subsidies for rural farmers were eliminated. State-owned enterprises were privatized, often sold to foreign companies at below-market prices. Arpaillange's footage shows the human cost of these policies: farmers abandoning their land, young people migrating to cities, families struggling to afford basic necessities. President Diouf, thrust into leadership during this crisis, had to navigate between international pressure for economic liberalization and domestic demands for continued social support. The filmmaker captured tense meetings between Senegalese officials and Western diplomats, revealing the limited sovereignty of African states in global economic decisions. What is particularly striking about Arpaillange's documentation is how it anticipated many of today's African political challenges. The youth unemployment he filmed in 1980s Dakar mirrors the demographic pressure facing countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa today. The tension between democratic ideals and economic dependency he observed in Senegal remains a defining challenge across the continent. Subscribe and hit the bell for more honest African political analysis you won't find elsewhere. Let us identify the key players in this story, because understanding their roles illuminates broader patterns in African politics. First, there is Léopold Sédar Senghor himself. By 1980, Senghor was 74 years old and had ruled Senegal for 2 decades. A Catholic in a predominantly Muslim country, an intellectual in a largely rural society, Senghor embodied the contradictions of post-colonial African leadership. Arpaillange's interviews reveal a man genuinely committed to African dignity and cultural renaissance, but also deeply embedded in French intellectual and political networks. Then there's Abdou Diouf, Senghor's hand-picked successor. At just 45 years old when he assumed power, Diouf represented a new generation of African leaders. Arpaillange's footage shows Diouf struggling to balance loyalty to Senghor's vision with the demands of a changing world. Unlike many African transitions, this one involved genuine mentorship and gradual power transfer. The opposition played a crucial role that Arpaillange documented carefully. Abdoulaye Wade, who would later become president himself, led the Senegalese Democratic Party in challenging the ruling Socialist Party. What's remarkable is that Senegal maintained competitive elections throughout this crisis period, something Arpaillange attributed to the country's strong Islamic civil society and traditions of dialogue. But perhaps the most important players were the ordinary Senegalese citizens. Arpaillange's most powerful footage shows farmers, traders, students, and workers adapting to economic crisis with remarkable resilience. He documented rotating credit associations, informal trade networks, and family support systems that kept communities functioning despite government failures. The international players were equally significant. French officials appear frequently in Arpaillange's footage, often wielding more apparent influence over Senegalese policy than elected Senegalese politicians. World Bank and IMF representatives are shown dictating terms for structural adjustment, with little apparent consideration for local consequences. Now, let's explore the different perspectives and reactions to Arpaillange's work, because this reveals important debates about how Africa is represented to global audiences. From the Senegalese government's perspective, Arpaillange's documentation was a double-edged sword. On one hand, his work highlighted Senegal's democratic achievements during a period when most African countries were under military or one-party rule. The peaceful transition from Senghor to Diouf was genuinely remarkable and deserved international recognition. But Senegalese officials were less enthusiastic about Arpaillange's focus on French influence and economic dependency. Government spokespersons argued that his analysis oversimplified complex relationships and ignored Senegal's agency in international affairs. They pointed out that Senegal had successfully avoided the military coups and civil wars plaguing neighboring countries. French reactions were predictably mixed. Progressive French intellectuals and journalists praised Arpaillange for honest documentation of neo-colonial relationships. But French government officials and business leaders criticized his work as one-sided and potentially damaging to Franco-African cooperation. Subscribe for honest, Pan-African analysis you want to find on CNN or BBC. More importantly, African intellectuals and activists had diverse reactions. Some praised Arpaillange for providing valuable documentation of a crucial period in African history. His footage offers rare insights into high-level political negotiations and the daily impact of structural adjustment policies. But other African voices criticized the entire premise of European filmmakers documenting African politics. They argued that external perspectives, no matter how sympathetic, inevitably distort African realities and reinforce patterns of intellectual dependency. Contemporary African filmmakers and journalists also noted that Arpaillange's access to high-level officials and international meetings reflected his position as a European observer. African journalists often faced restrictions and censorship that foreign correspondents could avoid. So what does Arpaillange's work on 1980s Senegal mean for Africa today? The patterns he documented: economic dependency, democratic fragility, generational change, and the tension between sovereignty and global integration remain central to African politics for decades later. First, his documentation of structural adjustment in Senegal provides crucial historical context for understanding current African economic challenges. The privatization, deregulation, and fiscal austerity imposed in the 1980s created many of the inequalities and institutional weaknesses that African countries still struggle to overcome. Second, Senegal's successful democratic transition, captured in Arpaillange's footage, offers important lessons for contemporary African politics. The country's ability to maintain competitive elections, peaceful power transfers, and civil liberties throughout economic crisis demonstrates that democracy is not a luxury African countries cannot afford. Third, the role of civil society, particularly Islamic organizations that Arpaillange documented in 1980s Senegal, provides insights into social resilience across Africa. Religious and traditional institutions often provide stability and social services when formal governments fail. Most importantly, Arpaillange's work raises ongoing questions about representation and voice in African political discourse. Who gets to tell African stories? How do external perspectives shape global understanding of African politics? What are the responsibilities of international observers documenting African affairs? These questions remain urgent as Africa faces new challenges: youth unemployment, climate change, technological transformation, and shifting global power dynamics. The continent needs accurate, nuanced documentation of these challenges, but it also needs African voices leading these conversations. Subscribe and hit the bell for more content that centers African perspectives on African issues. Looking ahead, Arpaillange's documentation of 1980s Senegal reminds us that African political development is neither linear nor predictable. Senegal today faces new challenges: youth migration, religious extremism, resource management that require the same careful observation and analysis that Arpaillange provided decades ago. The country's recent political developments, including peaceful alternation of power between different parties and generations, build on foundations documented in Arpaillange's work. Understanding this history is crucial for anyone seeking to comprehend contemporary African politics. Check out this next video where we explore how Senegal's democratic model has influenced political movements across West Africa. The patterns Arpaillange identified in the 1980s continue to shape political development from Mali to Ghana. What do you think about the role of foreign observers in documenting African politics? Should external perspectives be welcomed for their objectivity, or do they inevitably distort African realities? Comment your thoughts below. I read every single one and often feature the best insights in follow-up videos. Until next time, keep thinking critically about how African stories are told and who gets to tell them.